let's go over the CELAC summit. Like the CELAC summit happened this past week, as you know. But to give a little bit of context before that, the U.S. has been military striking boats in the Caribbean as part of what Trump is calling the narco terrorism situation. He's claiming that these boats are taking drugs from South America to the U.S. And I think, Sarah, can you put up the thing about CNN? Sorry. So CNN is reporting that the U.S. military has killed 80 people in 20 strikes that have destroyed 21 boats as part of a campaign that Washington says is aimed at curtailing the flow of drugs into the United States. As a response, President Maduro has called on the CELAC summit to condemn militarization of the militarization of the Caribbean. As we can see here on that's the CNN report. Sorry. And then if we can show them the Orinoco Tribune article with President Maduro's letter, where he says, the principle at stake today is clear and decisive: the sovereignty of states and the free self-determination of peoples. Venezuela declares this with absolute clarity. It does not accept and will not accept any tutelage. We do not accept that under euphemisms such as security or the war on drugs, the old Monroe Doctrine be imposed, seeking to turn our America into a stage for invasions and regime change coup to steal our immense wealth and natural resources. I mean, that pretty much sums up everything there. Of course, in the closing remarks of this CELAC EU summit, they sidestepped U.S. military aggression and didn't really respond to the U.S. military bombardment in that area. Matt, any comments on that? I know you have a tweet up showing the U.S. military C-130J planes arriving in Curacao. Is that Curacao? On 20th of October. And they've been flying in that area ever since. That's 40 miles from Venezuela. So what are your current discourse? You know, if you want to talk about CELAC at all, but any of your takeaways from CELAC, but also the current discourse that Venezuela might be the next Vietnam.
Well, it's worth just saying that the US has it's over 25 years of trying to remove the government of Venezuela, the democratically elected government. Chavez was elected the first time in 1998, came into power the following year, and then there was a coup attempt in 2002, which was actually successful for a while. They took Chavez to an island, and he thought he was going to get killed or thrown out of the plane. And then there was a big uprising from the people in the barrios who were seeing the benefits of the mineral wealth that they had under their land for the first time in many, many generations. And they reversed that coup. But then the US went back to what it usually does, which is just use its front groups, like National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, and obviously CIA and other intelligence agencies as well, just massive subversion. And then they moved on. They couldn't get rid of Chavez, who was very popular. Then he died in 2013. And then there's been a massive sanctions regime imposed on Venezuela as well, which has devastated the economy. You know, the economy is in bad shape, and it's made it hard for them to sell oil. It's made inflation huge. It's made a massive migration crisis as well. And this is this is a tapestry of different methods and mechanisms that the US empire has to remove governments that are not doing what they're told and are not opening up their economies to being ransacked by the US corporate sector. But it hasn't worked up till now. And the final, in my analysis, that they don't prefer to use the military. But when they've tried everything and it hasn't worked to remove the leader or the movement that they don't want in power, they move to the military. And it seems like they're really pushing for war now, and they're talking about invasion, or at least bombing strikes. And Pete Hegseth, the head of the Pentagon, said yesterday that he's launched Operation Southern Spear, which is going to be run by Southern Command, which is the US command structure, which covers the whole of Latin America and the Caribbean. And I imagine that it will involve strikes. I mean, it came out recently that Trump had told the CIA that they can operate within Venezuela. Obviously, we don't know what they're doing, but the US has a history of assassination, definitely kidnapping presidents. So I think that this is their kind of their foreign policy goal. And if you look at the people around Trump, like Marco Rubio is the Secretary of State, he's got a long history. He's like a right-wing Cuban descendant guy, like the people in Miami that have been pushing for the removal of Chavez and Maduro for decades. They really, really want to get rid of the leadership of in Venezuela, and there's a reason for that. It's got the largest proven oil reserves in the world. That is the reason they want to get it, and it's a strategic failure in terms of the U.S. empire. That the biggest oil deposits in the world are sitting underneath a country which is led by a government which is anti-imperialist. That is a nightmare for them. And interestingly, I think that part of the reason that it was allowed to happen, and not just Chavez in Venezuela, but the subsequent pink tide, in Ecuador, Brazil, Argentina, was because that coup in 2002, that was the year before the invasion of Iraq. And then the invasion of Iraq, as we know, went very badly, went wrong for the US. They were there a lot longer. They had to do the surge. They had to put hundreds of thousands of troops that they didn't want to put there. And they took their eye off the ball. And that I really think that is why the pink tide was allowed to happen, because we all know the history of the smashing by the US empire of the liberation movements and democratic socialist movements and anti-imperialist movements in Latin America during the Cold War. But nothing ever changed when the Soviet Union was dissolved. They're still constantly working around the clock, but a lot of their focus had to be on the Middle East, which was in flames. And obviously that's changed a bit now. They control Syria. Israel does a lot of their bombing for them. I think that they partly wanted to stop intervening so much in the Middle East so they can concentrate on their own backyard. And in fact, Hegseth, he even mentioned when he made his announcement about Operation Southern Spear, he said, "This is our neighborhood and we'll protect it." And again, none of this is new. Even the pretext that they're using, which is obviously preposterous, which is that this is about fighting narco terrorists or narco groups. This is a long history, and in fact picked up after the end of the Cold War, because they didn't need an excuse to go in to Latin America during the Cold War, because it was always the Soviet threat, even when it wasn't. They used that with Allende. They said he was gonna ally with the Soviets, even though he wasn't a communist in that sense. But then they lost that excuse, and that's when the war on drugs really took off, and they used it as an excuse to position Drug Enforcement Administration people, so DEA, CIA, military, all over Latin America. And that's still up to this day the excuse that they use. And none of it is real. I've spent quite a lot of time in Bolivia, and in fact Evo Morales kicked out the DEA in 2008, soon after 3 years after he became president. And cocoa production went down when the DEA were kicked out. The idea that the DEA is about stopping drug production is ridiculous, especially when the CIA is involved in drug running itself. So, but that's the same framework and the same propaganda is being put out about Venezuela. And you mentioned that 80 people have been killed in 20 strikes. It's very unlikely that any of them were even shipping drugs. And it's so obvious. One good thing about Trump is that he doesn't actually base his policy, or he doesn't present his policies in the usual sort of niced up liberal propaganda way. He's much more honest about it. So and that makes it hard for allies like Britain, like you mentioned in the beginning about how Britain apparently is now saying it won't share intelligence, but with the Americans from that it's collecting in the Caribbean. Again, they wouldn't do that if that was a Democratic president who was doing the same thing but saying all the right things. Trump's basically just like, this is our backyard, we can do what the hell we want. A lot of people are going to get killed. That's what he said. And then, sorry, I'll just finish with this. Like another example, which shows that this isn't just a Trump thing, is that Bush Senior, so the first Bush, who was president from 88 to 92, he invaded Panama in 1989 and removed the president, Manuel Noriega, who was previously a CIA asset for pretty much the whole of the 80s. He received millions of pounds from the CIA, and then they decided that they didn't like him anymore, and they invaded. He was taken and put in prison in the US, and then put in prison in France after that, and then died in prison in France. Oh no, sorry, he went back to Panama, but died in prison in Panama. And again, that was all done under the pretext that he was a narco drug runner. But he'd been doing exactly the same thing when he was on the CIA payroll. So it's all a massive excuse. I think that it's not going to be easy for them because the Americans, although they run the most powerful empire in history, they're not very good at it. They can't win wars. Like they can't win. They lost Iraq, Afghanistan. The Taliban's now in power after 20 years. That some people say they haven't won a war since Korea in the 50s. So I don't think they're prepared for what they will unleash in Venezuela.
Matt, you talked about the South Command. I want to share with everyone a video that speaks volume about the Monroe Doctrine, the classic one on Latin America. That's how Americans sees Latin America, and these are the explicit interests. This is Laura Richardson. She used to be the South the main commander, the principal. She was the protagonist of White House diplomacy with guns. Let's see what she has to say about South America.
Rich resources and rare earth elements. You've got the lithium triangle, which is needed for technology today. 60% of the world's lithium is in the lithium triangle: Argentina, Bolivia, Chile. You just have the largest oil reserves, light sweet crude, discovered off of Guyana over a year ago. You have Venezuela's resources as well with oil, copper, gold. China gets 36% of its food source from this region. We have the Amazon, lungs of the world. We have 31% of the world's fresh water in this region too.
Richardson es la responsable de uno de los comandos de combate que Estados Unidos tiene por el mundo, con más de 1,000 empleados focalizados en Centroamérica.
So she's saying she is responsible. She's the center, the brain of those commands that are listed for South America, with over 1,000 employees.
Sudamérica y el Caribe.
Laura Richardson afirma abertamente que esses países são questão de segurança nacional.
So she openly states that all those Latin American countries are a national security matter for the USA.
Para os Estados Unidos e devem ser controlados para impedir a influência da China.
And should be controlled to avoid China's influence. And it's very interesting because Laura Richardson made a speech on the US Senate saying that they need to use the TCO, transnational crime organizations, to put their foot there, to put their foot in Latin America. They should use those TCOs to say, let's do a collab with Latin America, and that's how we're going to infiltrate the Amazon, in strategic regions. But now, this is the classic stand. But Matt, I think there is an upgrade here with Trump. I don't think it's the same, because I want to know your thoughts. Trump is now using the Aliens Act, and he passed an executive order to upgrade those criminal organizations into terror organizations. It seems that Trump is upgrading the classic war on drugs, which is a geopolitical strategy for Latin America. You have different geopolitical strategies from the US empire, different faces, different masks, this is the one for Latin America. But now they are trying to say that Latin America drug cartels are terrorists. Can you explain to us what is the consequence, if you agree with me that there is an upgrade here and a substantial one, and what is the difference between the war on drugs and the war on terror? I would even say, is Venezuela the new Iraq?
Yeah, well, I agree. It's a different. The complexion of what Trump's doing is different because he's just got no constraints. They don't care, and like as you said, they cook up new legal justifications for doing what they're doing. But then that happened in Iraq as well. Look, with a torture program. You know, they called it. They had all these extensive and complex legal justifications for torture, which is unconstitutional. And they called it enhanced interrogation, but it's effectively what the CIA were doing during the war on terror on their black sites was was 100% torture, waterboarding, and completely illegal. But they did it anyway. So Trump is following in that line. He's more extreme and willing to do more reckless stuff. And that's why I think they haven't. But look, there's also his first term to look at what he did during his first term. Venezuela was a big priority as well, and he appointed Elliot Abrams, who is like this blood-soaked Washington insider who was actually convicted during the Iran-Contra scandal. He appointed him his point man for Venezuela, if you remember. And then like a couple of months later, Leopoldo Lopez and Juan Guaido literally tried to start an armed uprising on the streets of Caracas. I don't know if you remember that footage of them on the motorway with their guns, and they're like, we're going to take out the government. It was promoted by CNN. So he's tried that as well. But yeah, as you said, like it's a meld. When you said like, is it the war on terror? Is it a war on drugs? None of those. They're just propaganda terms. Basically, they just use them as a justification to get a policy done. And the policy now is the removal of Maduro, not because it's anything to do with drugs, but because he is not a part of the empire and also sits on the oil that the US wants, which she said, right? She said, and this is how imperialism always works. It's like it's a resource-based thing, and it's about control. It's also about geopolitical control, but resources are the primary priority for the policymakers in Washington and London and Berlin and places like that. That's what they want: control of the resources and control. But the interesting thing about Venezuela is Chevron does work in Venezuela. It's got some of the major contracts. So, but they haven't got complete control, and that's what they want. But it is, I think Trump is different. Trump's different in that he's more reckless and he doesn't care about nicing up what he's doing, which is it's good and bad. It's good for us because you can cleave away the whole of the liberal imperialist class because they can't use the usual propaganda. But obviously it's bad because it means the policies themselves are violent, and we might see an attack on Venezuela. And also, it won't stop with Venezuela. You know, if they're moving their priority to Latin America, they will go to other places too, like Colombia. Bolivia's been lost now, but places like Brazil, Cuba as well, obviously has been a massive obsession of Washington since the revolution in 1959. I think it's part of a strategic pivot back to their own backyard, as they say. And it's like you related to China, you know, and she mentioned China, Laura Richardson. If you go to Africa, they've kind of lost Africa to China. And China's type of power projection is much more Pacific, and it's much more economic. And like, for example, I've been to Africa and talked to people in governments and stuff, and they say, look, we're not under any illusion that the Chinese are here for charity. They want control and resources and stuff. But firstly, they do a lot of infrastructure for resources programs, so it builds up the country. Secondly, if the Chinese don't get a contract on the terms they want, they're just like, okay, fine, we'll move on to the next one. Whereas the US have a much more ideological way of doing things. Like, they'll be like, right, if you don't do what we tell you, we'll take you out. And Latin America, and also, they haven't lost. Sorry.
And also, I just like to point out that with China, you can negotiate different terms, and with the US, you can't. There's coercion and power involved. And I think another really important, because you've just hit upon my pet peeve, Matt, which was amazing. How long did it take? 25 minutes. Okay, good job. Well, it's just this idea, I think it's a very colonial mentality that countries that are coming to treat you as an equal should be treating you instead with charity. I think that's a very much, as the global South rises and a new multilateral world emerges, that's not going to be acceptable anymore. It's like part of the propaganda of colonialism that they were ever in the global South for charity. They would never were. It was always a cover. So I think that sort of mentality will sort of fall away as the global South rises. But really good point on everything, as usual. I would say that I want to point out, though, that the US sanctions against Venezuela that resulted in the consequent economic decline that now we're looking at 70% poverty rate in Venezuela was under Obama in 2015. He instituted those US sanctions. So I think it's, again, like we're saying, Trump has a different flavor of imperialism. It's more overt, mask off type of thing. We can see him coming. The danger, of course, there is that when Overton window gets moved further to the right, like things are just acceptable now that they might not have been. And the benefit is that we see him coming. But of course, the other counter problem with that is that, if a Democrat comes into office next term, will people go back to sleep? I mean, that's one of the issues. Although I just want to address because we have a question for you, Matt, here. Somebody is interested on everyone's view, but Matt/everyone view on Gustavo Petro, who was previously quite critical of Maduro. I think Petro is kind of the president of Colombia, right? It's quite interesting figure right now because he's also in the crosshairs of this narco terrorism and announced just recently that they will not be sharing intelligence with the US, which to me is quite funny in a way because they were put on the narco terrorism list in September, and only now they're like, we're no longer going to be sharing intelligence, which is ironic. At the same time, it's not a given, right? There's a lot of US puppet states that have to do things that are not in their own self-interest. But yes, what's your opinion of Gustavo Petro?
I'm a fan of Petro. I think that, you got to understand what he came into. Like, they always called Colombia the Israel of Latin America. It was the most heavily controlled US satellite in Latin America for decades, and interestingly, like, to go back to the drug war, if you look what the US did there, the drug war is a terrorist war. Like, I don't know if you guys remember the fumigation campaigns that the US started doing in Colombia, and what they're called fumigation campaigns. But what that is just dropping loads and loads of defoliants and chemicals on vast swathes of Colombian territory. What right does the United States have to drop chemicals on vegetation that they don't like? And it was part of a war against FARC and all that kind of stuff as well, which is, again, goes back to that point about the drug war being completely different, the image of it being completely different to the reality. But and then obviously the civil war was brutal, and the US supported Plan Colombia, which was actually begun under Clinton. Was a major part of the empowering the paramilitary groups, and then they got into government under Alvaro Uribe, who was like linked to countless paramilitary groups that were carrying out awful atrocities. At one point it was the most dangerous place in the world to be a trade unionist, Colombia, and they were there was complete lawlessness. I remember I went to Colombia to do a story about how Chiquita, the banana company, had they'd funded paramilitaries. It came out who were killing peasants who didn't want to give up their land, or trade unionists or dissidents against their operations. Anyway, they were taken to court in the US under the Alien Tort Statute, and we went to Colombia to talk to people who were like who had been victims of these paramilitaries. And I remember interviewing one woman, and this was when Uribe was in power, and she literally wouldn't. She was so scared she couldn't say his name. She was like, "I'm scared to even say his name." Like, and it's so different at odds. At that time, Colombia was being presented as this great, tourist destination, this developing economy, but it was a terror regime that basically you can just complete impunity. You can kill anyone you want. So in that context, having Petro come to power, who was like a Marxist revolutionary essentially, and also his deputy, who's amazing as well, Francia Marquez, who was like a maid, you know, an environmental activist. It's pretty amazing. And the fact that I was like, they would have, in a different time, they would not have been allowed to get to power, but they have, and they managed to stay in power, which is even more impressive, because as you say, like with the intelligence sharing, one of the interesting things about how the world operates is so much of the infrastructure of the state is impervious to the leader that is democratically elected. It's a continuity government effectively, and all those are right-wing deep forces that don't want change. So when you're sitting on top of that, it's very, very hard to operate, which is probably why they only recently stopped the intelligence sharing. And even that, like, I can imagine that will cause a massive ruckus within the state, because there's a whole swathe of the state that the democratically elected leaders are not meant to touch. So, and that's probably why JFK was killed as well. But like, it operates in every polity. You know, there's a deep structure to the state that does not want democratically leaders to mess with it. But he survived. But yeah, he probably will be next. That's what I'm saying. I don't think it's gonna. If they're doing a war on drugs, or they'll probably come up with a more new name for it. Operation Southern Spear might be the start of it. But what it is a pivot to getting rid of all the governments that aren't doing what they're told in Latin America, their backyard. And this goes back to the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century, and it's never been different. You know, they dominate and want to exploit and treat the Latin America and the Caribbean as if it's basically a doormat that they can do whatever they want. And even like, as I mentioned, Cuba's like the main obsession of these people, and they might be on next up. You know, I mean, even the fact that the United States owns Guantanamo Bay, that's like, they have no right to that. That's because it was previously a colony before the Castro Revolution, and they have as much right to that as Saddam Hussein had to Kuwait, or, like, you know what I mean? It's just ridiculous. And they have ratcheted up tensions with Cuba. So yeah, I mean, in that context, of course, I'm pro Petro. I think that I don't agree with everything he says. I don't agree, but he's also, the interesting thing is, it's become very clarified during the Gaza genocide, in that all the leaders in the world that have spoken out most forcefully are the ones that are outside the orbit of the United States, which is obviously not Israel. But it's interesting that it's all the whole alignment is about where do you stand in relation to the US empire. And he has basically been the leader in terms of presidents or prime ministers in speaking out in very robust terms against the genocide in Gaza. Previously, Evo did that in Bolivia as well. And he's actually done material things like stopped coal exports and other things, which, yeah, I think that's very impressive. I don't really think that we have we should be looking for perfection, or perfection even exists when you have such a rampant empire on your doorstep that is working around the clock. And of course, they're working around the clock to get rid of Petro. You know, there was about a year ago there, he made a speech where he said that there's an impending coup coming in, which I believed. I mean, I think that that's definitely a possibility, especially in Colombia. I'm surprised it hasn't happened yet, but we got to be on guard. As I mentioned though at the opening, I don't think they're very good at what they do, and I don't think they're ready for what they will. Like, Pete Hegseth is literally just stupid. Like, he's a former Fox News host. He's a meathead. He is a meathead. So if he's your strategy guy, he's heading the Pentagon. Trump obviously is not has barely any knowledge of geopolitics.
He's not the brains behind the operation, is he? He's more like the face. I mean, he's a well-known.
That's true, but they are essentially, they are the people who are leading it visually. Like, they're the faces. Like, they're not smart imperialists. Like, even like going into the US, if they thought it was smart to go into Venezuela, they would have done it before, but they haven't, because it's not going to be a cakewalk. Like in Panama, when they invaded in December in 1989, it was over by January. and I think they got a couple of hundred Americans died, but about 800 Panamanians. They got the guy and they got out, and it was fine. They got their client leader in. There's absolutely no way that's how Venezuela will turn out. It's like you mentioned Vietnam.
Sorry to interrupt you. Get back to your point, but because we have a follow-up question, but I just wanted to plug my new episode on Global Majority for Peace. I interviewed the founder of Orinoco Tribune, and he talked about how Eric Prince demands something like $100 million bounty when dealing with like mercenary assassinations, which is why the Venezuelan bounty on Maduro, the U.S. bounty on Maduro, went from I think 10 or 15 million to 50 million earlier this year, but they're trying to get it to 100 million. So I guess like to your point of whether or not there are operations covertly happening around the world, basically to get rid of head of states that stand up against the US. They definitely are, but they need to reach the level of like 100 million or whatever amount that these mercenary outfits deem, worth it.
Yeah, well, they might assassinate him. There's a law there's a law in the US that you can't do that because there was the Church Committee in 1975, which was like the most extensive congressional investigation of the CIA in history since it was created, and it revealed all these plots to kill leaders and blah 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 blah, and they put in a directive that you can't assassinate foreign leaders, but Trump does. There's no way he's going to abide by that. I mean, the more likely thing is they'd kidnap him. But
did you ever abided by that?
What?
Genuinely?
Well, I don't. I mean, who knows? You don't know because it's all covert. But
yeah,
there was definitely before the Church Committee. Sorry.
It's for a good reason that Trump evokes the Aliens Act, because the Aliens Act give you prerogatives that you don't have anything else. It has been even criticized by the military in the US. How he is exploding in extraterritorial waters ships from third-party countries. This violates international law, this violates maritime law. But I think, Ileana, and you touch upon another recipe, another element to eliminate a leader is to call him a dictator. At times, the US financed the dictator to a truly dictator and feels in the right to then remove them when they are no longer useful. And others, resistance leaders, they are not all the same. We have all Latin American resistance leaders, anti-imperialist leaders. They are often stigmatized as dictators because they are not succumbing to the USA. I want to share a video on Maduro's response on US trying to stigmatize him as a dictator. Let's see what he has to say to Washington.
¿Cómo voy a ser un dictador? Si no me formé en la Escuela de las Américas, ni en Harvard. Yo no me formé en Langley, West Point, Escuela de las Américas, ni Harvard. Yo me formé en los liceos de Caracas, en los barrios del Valle, 23 de enero, Katia, Propatria, el cementerio. ¿Cómo voy a ser un dictador?
Good point.